Hi everybody, I'm Mike McCrory and this is Would You Make It? If you've watched some of my videos, you may have seen me use the INCRA I-Box jig, and a few viewers have asked me to put together a video that shows how to use it. When I use the jig, I'm going to use a dado set in my table saw. So before I put the dado set in, I want to make sure that I get all the pieces for the sides of the box cut to the proper length so that I don't have to switch blades. Now that I've got the pieces cut, I want to just lay them out so that I have them properly oriented so that the grain lines up. So that piece goes there. And that piece goes on the end. So then I'm just going to label them. I'll put an A and an A. B and a B, and so on. The other thing I want to do is I want to mark the top edge, and I want to know which side goes out. And I kind of know that already because I put the letters on the outside, but just as a double check, I'm just going to put a little triangular mark with the wide end of the triangle pointing out. It doesn't really matter what kind of an indicator you use as long as you're using it consistently. What's really important though is that I know which edge is the top edge, because I'm going to use that when I put it in the box joint jig to make sure that the boards are oriented properly. So the next thing I want to do is set these pieces aside and use some test boards for setting up the box joint jig. And the reason I want to do that is when I make my first test cuts, they're probably not going to be set up exactly the way that I want. They're going to be either too tight or too loose. And so I don't want to waste the boards that I'm using for the box, the ultimate box that I'm going to make. So I'll use the test pieces, and then if things work out well with the test pieces, maybe I can make a box out of those as well. I've got my test pieces set up here, and these are just some leftover pieces of bird's eye maple. What I'm using for the box that I'm making is tiger maple, which I think will look nice. The bird's eye maple is nice too, but I just happen to have these pieces. Normally I wouldn't use something as nice as this. I would just use some poplar or something, but I didn't have any readily available. Now for the pieces that I'm using for the test cuts, it's not that important that they're the same size as the pieces that I'm using for the box. They don't have to be the same thickness. They don't have to be the same width. And in fact, these are not. They're close. You can see the heights are a little bit different. And the thickness, you probably can't see that on the camera, but the pieces that I'm using for the test cut are a little bit thicker. So that's not important, because what I'm really setting up with the jig is the distance or the thickness of the blade and the distance between the pins on the box joint jig, so that it's setting up the cuts spaced the way that I need them to be spaced so that I get a nice tight fit, not too tight, not too loose. So the first thing I'll do is I'll remove my blade and insert the dado blade. Use a 1/4 inch box joint. So that means I'm going to use the 2 outside blades from my dado set. And I just cleaned the blade because I got the blade gummed up a little bit when I was cutting some plywood for a cabinet. So I've cleaned the blades up and applied a coat of wax. So they should give very nice clean cuts. Okay, the first thing I'm going to do is remove this part of the jig. And I'm going to bring the wood over just to adjust the height of the blade. So I'll leave this flat. I'll raise the blade up until it looks like it's extending just above the piece of wood. And then the trick that I use is I slide this piece across, and I want it set so that it just hits and not much more than that. Otherwise I'll be leaving a big overhang that I have to clean up. This is a new table saw that I have, and this is the first time that I'm using the jig on the saw. So it's going to require some adjustment, because when I bring these two pin plates together, and I'm going to do that using the red knob on the left-hand side, when I bring them together, it's nowhere near the blade. There's probably 3/8 of an inch of a gap there. So to do that, I'm going to loosen this so that it slides off. And then I'm going to loosen up these two screws, one on the front and one on the back. And then I can slide the whole jig over so that the edge of the pin plate, is touching the blade. And that's what INCRA calls kissing the blade. I'll tighten this back up and then reassemble it. Okay, so now that I've done that, I want to just fine-tune the adjustments. You can see when I move the jig that the blade is moving a little bit as well. So that means that the pin plate is a little bit too close to the blade. So what I want to do is back that off a little bit, and I'm going to do that by rotating this micro adjustment knob clockwise to back it away. Put the scrap piece in place, and I will put the blade guard back in place just for safety and to help to hold the scrap piece in place. And then I'll make the cut. The objective is to use the blade width that I know now from this cut to set up the pin plates. And now what I'm going to do is I want the pin plates to fit tightly inside this slot. So I'm going to rotate the red knob until I have a snug fit. It's too loose still. So I can feel just a little bit of friction as I'm lifting the piece out. So I think that's pretty good. So now I'm going to tighten the positioning lock knob, that's what they call it, so that nothing will move anymore. And I'm ready to make the test cuts. Now, to prevent the possibility of tear out when you're cutting the piece, you want to make sure that you have a fresh piece of the MDF backer board. So it's on a sliding mechanism, so I'm going to loosen these screws and just slide it over to a fresh spot. You can see that I've used this multiple times already. And INCRA does sell replacement pieces of the MDF, or you can just make one of your own using 1/4 inch MDF. And I'll get the blade guard in place. And now I need to put the piece that I'm going to cut in place. So if you remember the marks that I made to mark the top edge of every piece, I'm going to position that so that it's always facing toward the center of the jig. I will use two pieces, one piece on either side of the pin plates, to tighten the blade guard and have it in the right position. And I want to have it so that it's tight enough that it holds the board firmly in place, but loose enough that I can get the pieces in and out as I'm making the cuts.
Now when I'm making the first cut, I have the board positioned against the right pin plate. That will give me the starting point. And then for the next cut, I move the board over again, touching the right side of the pin plate. And then for every subsequent cut, the cut that I just made is sitting over the pin plate. And this indexes every cut so that they are properly spaced.
Now when it comes to setting up the cuts for the adjoining piece, I'm going to use the piece that I just cut to help me to position this so that I have a starting point. And so I'm going to take that same top edge mark, point it toward the center, as we always do. But then to get the starting point, because they have to fit into these cuts that have already been made, I'm going to flip this piece over so that the top edge is also pointing toward the center. So the two top edges are touching each other. I'm going to position that with the first cut in the pin plates, and then I'm going to put the pieces touching right together. Then I will remove the piece that I've already cut, and that will be the place where I'm going to start the cut on this piece. Now I can test the fit, and it's actually pretty good, surprisingly good actually. What I was hoping was going to happen is that it was going to be a little bit too tight or a little bit too loose, and I would show you how to adjust that. I will still talk about how to adjust it, but there's definitely no need to do that in this case. It's a very nice fit. So that just shows that by following the instructions for setup, and what's particularly important is setting up the position of the pin plates. When you kiss the blade, you want to just barely touch the blade. And also when you're adjusting the friction, when you're setting the spacing between the pin plates, you want to have just enough friction. And I guess that's just a little bit of experience that I've gained in using this a number of times. Certainly the first time that I did this, the joint was, I don't remember, but it was either too loose or too tight. Now the pieces that I used for the test cut fit really well, much better than I expected they would on my first attempt. So let's spend a minute and talk about what you would do if the joint is too tight or if the joint is too loose. And it's really quite simple. There's just one adjustment knob that you need to use, and that's this micro adjust knob on the outside. So to use that, you would loosen this knob on the top so that everything can slide. You hold the red knob in place and then turn the micro adjust knob either counterclockwise or toward the left, looking at it from the top, toward the left if you want to loosen it, or toward the right or clockwise if you want to tighten it. And in English, we have an expression, lefty-loosey, righty-tighty, and that's pretty easy to remember. Other languages, I don't know if you have a similar expression. So just remember, counterclockwise, looser, clockwise, tighter. And there's a little slit right here that you can line up with the increments on the red dial, and every increment is equal to 1/1000th of an inch. So you can control it pretty precisely just by turning it increment by increment. And if you do a full rotation, that is 1/32nd of an inch. When I turn this counterclockwise, that's making it looser, and I'm making it looser by making the pin smaller. I'm making the pin smaller by moving the pin plates closer to the blade so that it's narrower when it's cut. And you can see that as I'm turning this, it's getting closer and closer to the blade. If I move it the other way, clockwise, it's making the pin larger, and that will make a tighter fit. It's not changing the spacing between these two. To change the spacing between them, that's done with the red knob, and I'm changing it now because I've already finished all my cuts, but you normally don't want to change that once you've set it up for the thickness here. And right now it's a little bit looser than I had it, I believe. So I'll tighten that up a little bit. Now it's a little tighter, I can tell by the amount of friction. So I'll loosen it again, and that's about right. Once I have everything adjusted the way that I want, and before I make my first cut, I will tighten this knob on the top, and that just locks everything in place so that I can begin my cut. So it's really quite simple to adjust the fit of the box joint. Whether it's too tight or too loose, you can make the adjustment by changing the micro adjust knob. And if you're an English speaker, it's even easier by remembering righty-tighty, lefty-loosey. Turn it right to tighten, turn it left to loosen. And that's it.